The morning mist hung thick around Balmoral Castle as Camilla Parker Bowles hurriedly packed her leather suitcase. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded each piece of clothing with unusual care. The events of the past week had shaken her to the core, and she knew that staying in Britain was no longer safe for her reputation or her future. The scandal had erupted like wildfire through the British media. Secret recordings of private conversations had somehow found their way to the press, revealing details about royal finances that were never meant to see daylight. Camilla's name was mentioned repeatedly in these recordings, and while she maintained her innocence, the public outcry was deafening. Protesters gathered outside every royal residence demanding answers and accountability. Her phone buzzed constantly with calls from reporters, palace officials, and concerned friends. Each ring felt like another nail in the coffin of her carefully constructed life. She had worked so hard to win over the British people after her controversial relationship with Prince Charles became public. Years of charity work, public appearances, and genuine efforts to serve the crown were now overshadowed by accusations she couldn't fully understand. The palace had advised her to lay low until the investigation was complete, but Camilla could read between the lines. The royal family was distancing themselves from her, and she suspected that certain members were actively working to ensure she took the blame for the financial irregularities. The very people she had trusted were now treating her like a liability. Her sister Annabelle had called the night before, offering her a place to stay at their family estate in France. "Come here until this all blows over," she had urged. "The French media won't be as brutal, and you can think clearly away from all this chaos." The offer seemed like a lifeline in the storm that had engulfed her life. As dawn broke over the Scottish Highlands, Camilla made her decision. She would leave quietly, without fanfare or official announcement. Her lawyer could handle the media statements while she regrouped and planned her next move from the safety of French soil. She had enough savings in her personal accounts to live comfortably for months, maybe even years if necessary. The suitcase closed with a soft click, and she took one last look around the room that had been her sanctuary. Family photos smiled back at her from the dresser, including one of her late father who had always told her to stand up for herself when times got tough. "I'm sorry, Daddy," she whispered to the photograph. "But sometimes strategic retreat is the only option." Her driver Thomas had been with the family for over a decade and had agreed to take her to a private airfield outside Edinburgh. She trusted him completely, and he had promised to keep her departure confidential. The plan was simple: drive to the airfield, board a private jet to Paris, and disappear from the British spotlight until the investigation concluded. As she wheeled her suitcase down the castle's ancient corridors, every footstep echoed like a drumbeat announcing her departure. The staff she passed offered polite nods, but she could see the questions in their eyes. Word traveled fast in royal circles, and she knew that rumors about her leaving would spread within hours of her departure. The castle's grand entrance loomed ahead, and through the heavy oak doors she could see Thomas waiting beside the black sedan. The engine was already running, exhaust visible in the cold morning air. Freedom was just steps away, but as she reached for the door handle, she heard the unmistakable sound of military boots approaching from behind. "Your Royal Highness," came a firm but respectful voice. "I'm afraid I cannot allow you to leave the premises at this time." Camilla turned slowly to face Captain James Morrison of the Royal Protection Unit. She had known James for 3 years, and he had always been professional and courteous during his duties. But today something was different in his steel-gray eyes. The usual warmth was replaced by an official coldness that sent a chill down her spine. "Captain Morrison," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady, "I wasn't aware that I needed permission to travel. This is a personal matter, and I have every right to visit my family in France." She gripped the handle of her suitcase tighter, as if holding on to it could somehow maintain her freedom. The captain stepped closer, and she noticed that 2 additional guards had quietly positioned themselves near the entrance. They weren't pointing weapons or making threatening gestures, but their presence was unmistakably authoritative. "Ma'am, I have direct orders from Buckingham Palace. You are not to leave British soil until further notice. This directive comes from the highest levels of government." The words hit her like a physical blow. She had expected resistance from the media, and perhaps some political pressure, but she had never imagined that she would be essentially imprisoned in her own country. "On what grounds?" she demanded, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "I haven't been charged with any crime, and I haven't been formally accused of wrongdoing." Captain Morrison's expression softened slightly, revealing the conflict he felt about his orders. "Ma'am, I'm not privy to all the details, but I understand that your departure could be seen as fleeing the jurisdiction during an active investigation. The authorities need you to remain available for questioning." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'm truly sorry, but I have no choice but to follow these orders." Behind them, Thomas had stepped out of the car and was approaching the entrance. His weathered face showed confusion and concern as he witnessed the tense exchange. "Is everything all right, Your Highness?" he called out, his voice carrying decades of loyal service and genuine worry. Camilla felt trapped between her desire to flee and her understanding of the impossible position Captain Morrison was in. She knew that he was a good man following orders, but those orders felt like chains binding her to a sinking ship. "And if I refuse to comply?" she asked quietly, though she already suspected the answer. The captain's jaw tightened. "Then I would be forced to detain you, ma'am. I sincerely hope it doesn't come to that." His hand moved almost imperceptibly toward his radio, a subtle reminder that reinforcements were just a call away. The other guards shifted their weight, ready to act if necessary. The morning sun had risen higher, casting long shadows across the castle's courtyard. A few staff members had gathered at windows, drawn by the unusual scene unfolding at the main entrance. Camilla could see their faces pressed against the glass, and she knew that within hours, word of this confrontation would reach every corner of the royal household. Her mind raced through possible alternatives. She could demand to speak with Prince Charles, but their relationship had been strained since the scandal broke. She could call her lawyer, but legal challenges would take time she didn't have. The media circus would only intensify if news of her attempted departure became public, painting her as someone with something to hide. "Captain," she said finally, her voice regaining some of its regal authority, "if I am to remain in Britain, then I insist on certain conditions. I want to speak with my legal counsel immediately, and I want a full explanation of the charges or suspicions against me. I will not be held prisoner without understanding why." Captain Morrison nodded respectfully. "I will relay your requests to my superiors immediately, Your Highness. But for now, I must ask you to return to your quarters and surrender any travel documents you may have with you." He gestured toward the suitcase she still clutched. "I'm also required to inspect your luggage to ensure you're not attempting to remove any evidence or sensitive materials." The request felt like the final insult. Her personal belongings, packed with such care and hope just hours before, were now subject to scrutiny like those of a common criminal. But Camilla realized that resistance would only make her situation worse. With great dignity, she straightened her shoulders and met the captain's gaze directly. "Very well, Captain Morrison, but I want this search conducted properly, with witnesses present, and I want a full inventory of everything you examine. If I am to be treated as a suspect, then I insist on being treated as an innocent suspect with rights that must be respected." The small sitting room adjacent to the castle's main hall had been hastily converted into an impromptu investigation area. Captain Morrison had called for a female officer to conduct the search, respecting protocol and Camilla's dignity. Detective Inspector Sarah Chen from the Special Branch had arrived within 30 minutes, her professional demeanor offering a small comfort in an increasingly surreal situation. Camilla sat rigidly in a high-backed chair, watching as her personal belongings were carefully removed from the leather suitcase and placed on a mahogany table. Each item seemed to tell the story of her interrupted escape. Practical clothes for traveling, medications, jewelry that held sentimental value, and a small leather journal where she had been documenting the events of the past week. Detective Inspector Chen worked methodically, photographing each item before examining it closely. Her training in handling sensitive royal matters was evident in her respectful approach, but the thoroughness of her search left no doubt about the seriousness of the situation. "Ma'am, I'll need to examine this journal," she said, holding up the small leather book. "That contains my private thoughts," Camilla protested, her voice strained with exhaustion and frustration. "Surely you cannot believe that my personal diary contains evidence of financial wrongdoing." But even as she spoke, she remembered some of the entries she had written in anger and desperation over the past week. Had she written anything that could be misinterpreted or taken out of context? The detective's expression remained neutral as she carefully flipped through the pages. Camilla watched her face for any sign of reaction, any indication of what she might be finding. The silence stretched uncomfortably, broken only by the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece and the distant sound of staff going about their morning duties. "Your Highness," Detective Inspector Chen said finally, her voice carrying a note of surprise. "There are several entries here that reference meetings and conversations that weren't disclosed to investigators. You mentioned speaking with foreign bank representatives and discussions about offshore accounts." She looked up from the journal, her expression serious but not accusatory. Camilla felt her heart sink. The meetings the detective was referring to were completely innocent. Consultations about her own personal finances that had nothing to do with royal funds. But she realized how they might appear to investigators who were looking for evidence of impropriety. "Those entries refer to my personal financial planning," she explained quickly. "I was consulting with advisors about securing my own assets in case I needed to leave royal life permanently." Captain Morrison, who had been standing quietly by the window, turned to face them. "Ma'am, I think it would be best if you had legal counsel present before we discuss these matters further. This search has revealed materials that may be relevant to the ongoing investigation, and anything you say could potentially be used in legal proceedings." The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Camilla realized that what had started as a simple attempt to visit her sister had now escalated into something much more serious. She was no longer just a person of interest in a financial investigation. She was becoming a primary suspect. "I want to call my solicitor immediately," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "And I want to know exactly what I'm being accused of. This entire situation has spiraled beyond reason, and I will not sit here while my reputation is destroyed by misunderstandings and coincidences." Detective Inspector Chen nodded and closed the journal carefully. "Of course, Your Highness. But I must inform you that this journal, along with certain other items from your luggage, will need to be retained as potential evidence. You'll receive a proper receipt for everything we're taking." She began placing selected items into evidence bags, each one sealed and labeled with meticulous care. As Camilla watched her possessions being catalogued and seized, she felt a profound sense of violation. The small silver locket that had belonged to her grandmother, a few personal letters from friends, and even her passport were all being treated as potential evidence in a case she still didn't fully understand. The life she had built so carefully was being dismantled piece by piece. "There's something else," Detective Inspector Chen said quietly, holding up a small USB drive that had been hidden in a side pocket of the suitcase. "What's on this device, ma'am?" Her tone was gentle but insistent, and Camilla could see that this discovery had changed the dynamic of the entire search. Camilla stared at the USB drive, her mind racing. She had completely forgotten about it in her haste to pack, but now she remembered exactly what it contained, and why its discovery could destroy any chance she had of proving her innocence. The USB drive sat on the mahogany table like a tiny bomb waiting to explode. Camilla's mouth had gone completely dry as she stared at the small device that contained information she had hoped never to use. Her silence stretched uncomfortably, and she could feel the eyes of both investigators boring into her, waiting for an explanation that she wasn't sure she could give without making everything infinitely worse. "Ma'am?" Detective Inspector Chen prompted gently. "We need to know what's stored on this device. Given the circumstances of the investigation, any digital media in your possession requires immediate examination." She held the USB drive up to the light, as if its contents might somehow be visible through the plastic casing. Camilla closed her eyes briefly, weighing her options. The drive contained audio recordings and financial documents that could either completely exonerate her or implicate several high-ranking members of the royal household in far more serious crimes than she had ever been accused of. She had obtained these materials months ago when she first became suspicious about irregularities in royal finances, but she had hoped never to use them. "Those files contain sensitive information," she said carefully, opening her eyes to meet the detective's gaze. "Information that could be damaging to the monarchy if it became public. I obtained them as insurance in case I was ever falsely accused of financial impropriety." She paused, knowing that her next words would cross a line from which there might be no return. "They prove that the real financial misconduct has been happening at much higher levels than anyone realizes." Captain Morrison stepped closer to the table, his expression grave. As a member of the Royal Protection Unit, he understood the implications of what Camilla was suggesting better than anyone. "Your Highness, are you saying that you have evidence of criminal activity involving other members of the royal family?" His voice was barely above a whisper, as if speaking the words too loudly might make them more real. The room fell completely silent except for the steady ticking of the clock. Outside, life continued normally. Gardeners tended to the grounds, staff prepared for the day's activities, and the world remained blissfully unaware that the foundations of the British monarchy might be about to shift dramatically. Camilla felt the weight of centuries of tradition pressing down on her shoulders. "I'm saying that I discovered financial transfers and communications that suggested someone was using royal accounts for personal gain," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "When I tried to report my concerns through proper channels, I was told to remain quiet for the good of the crown. When I persisted, I suddenly found myself being investigated for the very crimes I had tried to expose." Detective Inspector Chen exchanged a meaningful look with Captain Morrison. Both of them understood that this case had just become exponentially more complex and politically sensitive. "Ma'am, if what you're suggesting is true, then this USB drive contains evidence that could be crucial to the investigation. However, it also means that your attempted departure from the country takes on a very different significance." Camilla realized the trap she had walked into. By revealing the existence of the evidence, she had essentially confirmed that she had reasons to flee beyond simple embarrassment or media pressure. In the eyes of the law, her attempted departure now looked like the actions of someone who possessed dangerous information and was trying to escape before being forced to reveal it. "Wasn't running away from the investigation," she said, though even to her own ears the words sounded hollow. "I was protecting myself from people who would do anything to keep their crimes hidden. You have to understand. When you discover that people you trust are capable of financial fraud, you start to wonder what else they might be capable of." The detective began putting on latex gloves to handle the USB drive more carefully. "Your Highness, I'm going to need to examine the contents of this device immediately. Given what you've told us, this could be evidence in multiple criminal investigations. However, I must warn you that once we begin this process, there will be no going back. The information will become part of the official record." As Detective Inspector Chen prepared to insert the USB drive into her laptop, Camilla felt a moment of panic. Once the contents were revealed, she would become more than just a suspect. She would become a key witness in what could be the biggest royal scandal in modern British history. Her life would never return to normal, regardless of her own innocence or guilt. "Wait," she said suddenly, causing both investigators to freeze. "Before you open those files, I need you to understand something. The people implicated in those documents have significant power and influence. Once you see what's on that drive, you'll be in as much danger as I am. Are you prepared for the consequences of that knowledge?" Captain Morrison and Detective Inspector Chen exchanged another look, this time filled with the understanding that their morning had taken a turn none of them could have anticipated. The simple task of preventing a flight to France had uncovered what might be a conspiracy, reaching to the very heart of the British establishment. Detective Inspector Chen's finger hovered over the laptop's USB port for what felt like an eternity. The small device in her hand had transformed from a simple piece of evidence into a potential catalyst for constitutional crisis. She looked at Captain Morrison, whose military training had prepared him for many scenarios, but not for the possibility that he might be about to uncover treason within the institution he had sworn to protect. "Ma'am," the detective said slowly, "if these files contain evidence of crimes involving senior royals, then I have a legal obligation to examine them regardless of the potential consequences. But I want you to be absolutely certain about what you're telling us. False allegations against the crown could result in charges of sedition." Camilla felt a bitter laugh escape her lips. "Sedition? Detective, I've spent the last 3 years of my life trying to serve the crown faithfully, only to discover that others have been systematically betraying it for personal gain. If exposing the truth is sedition, then perhaps the institution itself has lost its way." Her words carried the weight of profound disillusionment and deep personal pain, Captain. Morrison moved to the window and peered through the heavy curtains. "Your Highness, I need to call this into my superiors. What you're describing goes far beyond my authority to handle. If there's even a possibility that senior royals are involved in criminal activity, then this needs to be escalated to the highest levels of security services. His hand moved toward his radio, but he hesitated, understanding that this call would set irreversible events in motion. "James," Camilla said, using his first name for the first time in their 3-year professional relationship. "Before you make that call, you need to understand that my attempted departure this morning wasn't about running from justice. It was about preserving evidence until I could find someone trustworthy enough to handle it properly. The moment I tried to report my concerns through official channels, I became a target." The detective inserted the USB drive into her laptop with deliberate precision. The device hummed quietly as it recognized the new hardware, and within seconds, a directory of files appeared on the screen. Camilla watched as Detective Inspector Chen's expression changed from professional curiosity to shock, then to something approaching disbelief. "Dear God," the detective whispered, scrolling through folder names that referenced offshore accounts, Swiss banks, and what appeared to be coded communications between royal household staff and foreign financial institutions. "How long have you had these files?" Her voice had taken on an urgency that hadn't been there moments before. "I started collecting them about 6 months ago," Camilla replied, her voice growing stronger as she finally shared the burden she had been carrying alone. "I noticed discrepancies in charity fund reports, unexplained transfers from the duchy accounts, and communications that seemed designed to avoid official oversight. When I tried to discuss my concerns with senior household staff, I was told that financial matters were not my responsibility." Captain Morrison had moved away from the window and was now standing behind the detective, reading over her shoulder. His face had gone pale as he recognized some of the names in the file directories. "Ma'am, some of these files reference communications with individuals who are known to have connections to international money laundering operations. This isn't just financial impropriety. This could be evidence of serious organized crime." The laptop screen displayed a spreadsheet showing transfers totaling millions of pounds, dates spanning several years, and account numbers that clearly didn't belong to any official royal financial institution. Detective Inspector Chen clicked on an audio file, and the room filled with the sound of a familiar voice discussing methods for moving money without triggering banking regulations. "That's Sir Andrew Patterson," Camilla said quietly, referring to a senior palace official who had been publicly praised for his financial stewardship of royal estates. "He's been systematically diverting funds from various royal accounts and using the monarchy's reputation to facilitate laundering operations for criminal organizations. The voice you're hearing is from a recording I made during a meeting where he tried to recruit me into the scheme." The detective paused the audio file and looked up at Camilla with new respect and understanding. "You were gathering evidence to expose this conspiracy, weren't you? That's why you kept quiet initially. You were building a case." Her earlier suspicion had been replaced by recognition of Camilla's courage in attempting to single-handedly investigate such a dangerous operation. "I thought if I could gather enough evidence, I could present it to someone who would actually act on it," Camilla replied. "But the more I learned, the more I realized how extensive the network was. People I trusted were involved, and I began to fear for my safety. When the media storm broke and I realized I was being set up as the scapegoat, I knew I had to get these files to safety before they could be destroyed or used against me." Captain Morrison had been listening to their exchange while continuing to scan through the files on the laptop. Suddenly, he stepped back from the screen as if he had been physically struck. "Your Highness," he said, his voice barely audible, "there are communications here involving my own commanding officer. This conspiracy reaches into the Royal Protection Unit itself." The three of them stared at each other in the sudden understanding that they were no longer just investigating financial crimes. They had stumbled into a web of corruption that threatened the very security of the royal family and the stability of the British government. The revelation that corruption had penetrated the Royal Protection Unit sent a chill through the room that had nothing to do with the Scottish morning air. Captain Morrison stood frozen, staring at communications that implicated Colonel Richards, his direct superior, and a man he had served under for 8 years. The emails detailed arrangements for deliberately weakening security protocols during certain transfers of royal funds, creating opportunities for the financial crimes to occur undetected. "James, I'm sorry," Camilla said softly, watching the devastation on the captain's face. "I wanted to tell you sooner, but I wasn't sure who I could trust. When you stopped me from leaving this morning, I thought perhaps you were part of it too." Her admission hung in the air between them, a painful acknowledgement of how thoroughly the conspiracy had poisoned relationships throughout the royal household. Detective Inspector Chen had opened another folder and was examining what appeared to be photographs of official documents. These show forged authorizations for fund transfers, all bearing what looks like authentic royal seals and signatures. The level of access required to produce these forgeries suggests involvement from someone very high in the palace hierarchy. She looked up at Camilla with growing concern. "How many people knew you were collecting this evidence?" "I thought I had been careful," Camilla replied, but doubt crept into her voice as she considered the question more carefully. "I used a personal laptop not connected to palace networks, and I kept the USB drive hidden in my private quarters. But looking back, there were signs that someone suspected what I was doing. Meetings were rescheduled at the last minute. Certain staff members became evasive when I asked routine questions about finances, and I started receiving subtle warnings about the dangers of being too curious." Captain Morrison had recovered enough to begin thinking tactically about their situation. "If Colonel Richards is compromised, then my regular reports about your activities have been going directly to the conspiracy. They know exactly what you've been doing, where you've been going, and probably what you've discovered." He moved back to the window and carefully peered out through the curtains. "In fact, they probably know about this conversation right now." The detective immediately began copying files from the USB drive to her own encrypted storage device. "We need to get this evidence to secure hands immediately. If the local chain of command is compromised, we'll have to go around it entirely." Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard as she selected the most critical files for immediate backup. "Who can we trust?" Camilla asked. The question that had been haunting her for months finally spoken aloud. "If the corruption reaches from senior palace officials into the security services, then normal reporting channels are completely unreliable. We could hand this evidence to someone who's part of the conspiracy, and it would disappear forever." Captain Morrison had been considering the same problem, running through his contacts in government and security services, trying to identify someone whose integrity was beyond question. "There's someone," he said finally. "Chief Inspector Margaret Thornton at Scotland Yard. She's been investigating international financial crimes for 15 years, and she has a reputation for absolute incorruptibility. More importantly, she operates independently of both palace security and the regular chain of command." "But how do we contact her without alerting the conspiracy?" Detective Inspector Chen asked, continuing to copy files while speaking. "If they're monitoring communications, any attempt to reach outside help could be intercepted." She paused in her copying and looked at both of them seriously. "We also need to consider that our lives may be in danger once they realize what we've discovered." The weight of their situation settled over them like a heavy blanket. They were three people sitting in a castle surrounded by people who might be enemies, holding evidence that could destroy powerful individuals who had already demonstrated their willingness to commit serious crimes. The morning that had begun with a simple attempt to travel to France had become a fight for survival and justice. "There's a secure communication system in the castle's old tower," Captain Morrison said, his military training taking over as he began to formulate a plan. "It was installed during the Cold War for emergency communications, and it operates on completely separate networks from the modern palace systems. If we can get there without being observed, we can contact Chief Inspector Thornton directly." Camilla stood up from her chair with new determination. "Then that's what we have to do. I've been running and hiding long enough. If this evidence can stop these criminals and protect the monarchy from further damage, then we have to take the risk." She looked at the USB drive, now safely stored in Detective Inspector Chen's encrypted device. "Those files represent months of careful investigation and considerable personal danger. We can't let them be wasted." Detective Inspector Chen closed her laptop and gathered the evidence bags containing Camilla's other possessions. "I agree, but we need to move carefully. If they suspect what we're doing, they'll try to stop us before we can get the evidence to safety." She looked toward the door, beyond which lay corridors that might contain allies or enemies. "How do we get to this communication system without raising suspicion?" Captain Morrison checked his watch and considered the castle's daily routines. The morning shift change happens in 20 minutes. During the handover, there's always confusion and distraction. If we time it right, we can move through the castle using service corridors that are usually empty during shift changes. He looked at both women seriously. But once we start this, there's no going back. We'll be committed to exposing the entire conspiracy, regardless of the consequences. The ancient stone corridors of Balmoral Castle had witnessed centuries of royal secrets, but none quite like the desperate mission now unfolding in their shadows. Captain Morrison led the way through narrow service passages that hadn't been used for their original purpose in decades. His knowledge of the castle's layout proving invaluable as they avoided the main thoroughfares where other staff might question their presence. Detective Inspector Chen followed closely behind, her laptop bag containing the precious evidence that could reshape the entire British establishment. Every footstep echoed softly off the stone walls, and each sound made them pause, listening for any indication that they had been discovered. The weight of what they were carrying, both literally and figuratively, made even the simplest movement feel monumentous. Camilla brought up the rear, her designer shoes clicking softly against the flagstones despite her efforts to move quietly. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now sneaking through her own home like a fugitive, carrying evidence that could destroy the very institution she had tried so hard to serve faithfully. But the events of the morning had crystallized her resolve. Protecting the truth was more important than protecting her position. They reached the base of the old tower without incident, but Captain Morrison held up his hand as voices became audible from the main corridor. Through a gap in the ancient stonework, they could see two palace guards engaged in what appeared to be an urgent conversation. The captain strained to hear their words, and his expression grew increasingly grim as he listened. "They're looking for us," he whispered to the others. "Someone reported that you never returned to your quarters as ordered, and they've initiated a security sweep of the entire castle." He checked his watch again, calculating how much time they had before the search reached their current location. "We need to move faster." The spiral staircase to the tower's communication room seemed to stretch endlessly upward, each step taking them higher into the castle's oldest section. The walls here were thick enough to muffle sound, but they also felt like a prison, trapping them in a narrow space with no alternative escape routes if they were discovered. Detective Inspector Chen's breathing had become labored from the climb and the stress of their situation. Finally, they reached a heavy wooden door marked with faded government security warnings. Captain Morrison produced an old-fashioned brass key and inserted it into the lock, which turned with surprising smoothness despite its apparent age. "This room hasn't been used in over a decade," he explained as they entered, "but the equipment is maintained regularly as part of national emergency protocols." The communication room felt like stepping back in time, filled with equipment that looked more like a Cold War museum than modern technology. But when Captain Morrison activated the system, banks of lights came alive and the quiet hum of electronics filled the air. "This connects directly to Scotland Yard's emergency network," he explained as he began inputting access codes. "No one can intercept or monitor communications through this system." Within minutes, they had established contact with Chief Inspector Thornton, who listened with growing amazement as they outlined their discovery. Her voice crackled through the old speakers with professional authority, tempered by genuine shock. "What you're describing represents one of the most serious breaches of national security in recent history. I'm dispatching a specialist team immediately, but you need to secure your location until they arrive." Detective Inspector Chen began transmitting the digital evidence through the secure connection, watching as file after file uploaded to Scotland Yard's protected servers. "Chief Inspector, you should know that the corruption extends into the Royal Protection Unit itself. We can't trust normal security protocols, and we have reason to believe that our lives may be in danger once the conspiracy realizes what we've exposed." Through the tower's ancient windows, they could see increased activity in the castle's courtyard below. More vehicles had arrived, and personnel were moving with the kind of urgency that suggested a major security operation. "They know we're missing," Camilla observed, watching the deployment of additional guards around the castle's perimeter. "How long before they think to check this tower?" Chief Inspector Thornton's voice came through the speakers with reassuring authority. "I've contacted the Home Secretary directly and emergency protocols are being activated. A joint task force from Scotland Yard and MI5 is en route to your location, with full authority to take control of the situation. You've done something incredibly brave and important today. Your evidence will allow us to dismantle a criminal network that has been operating with impunity for years." The sound of footsteps on the spiral staircase below made them all freeze. Captain Morrison moved to the door and listened carefully, his hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm. The footsteps were getting closer and they could hear voices, multiple people climbing toward their location with obvious purpose. "Chief Inspector, we may be out of time," he said into the microphone. "Hold your position," came the immediate response. "My team is 2 minutes away from the castle entrance. You have legal authority to defend yourselves and the evidence you're protecting. Do not surrender that material to anyone except my officers, who will identify themselves with the code phrase Highland Sunrise." The door handle began to turn slowly, and the three of them pressed back against the far wall of the communication room. But instead of the conspirators they expected, the door opened to reveal Thomas, Camilla's loyal driver, his weathered face creased with worry and determination. "Your Highness," he said quietly, "there are police vehicles approaching the castle and Colonel Richards is ordering all exits sealed." "I thought you should know, whatever you're doing up here. It appears to be working." As if summoned by his words, the sound of helicopters became audible overhead, and through the windows they could see official vehicles streaming through the castle gates. The investigation that had begun with a simple attempt to visit France was about to expose one of the most significant criminal conspiracies in modern British history, and the three unlikely allies who had uncovered it watched as justice finally began to arrive at the ancient Scottish stronghold.